The receiving line had been standing for 40 minutes when the Duke of Callanmere walked through the door. And Philippa Ashworth, who had not been told his name, understood only that the room had changed. She felt it before she saw him. The particular quality of attention that moved through 63 assembled guests like a current through still water, a collective realignment of faces toward the entrance hall, and then the sound of the ballroom settling into a lower, tighter register, as though the music had not changed but the air carrying it had. She was speaking to Colonel Merritt's wife at the time, nodding at something the woman had said about the flowers, and she looked up. He was tall and dark-coated, and utterly still inside the movement of the room. He handed his hat to the footman without looking at the footman. His eyes, which were the color of smoke against winter glass, moved across the ballroom with the measuring patience of a man who was accustomed to arriving and having rooms arrange themselves accordingly. They moved across the candelabra, across the long tables laid with supper silver, across the musicians in their corner, across the receiving line. They stopped, very briefly, on Philippa. She returned her attention to Colonel Merritt's wife and agreed that the roses were particularly fine this year. She did not know, in that moment, what the stop had cost him. She would not know for some time. What she knew. Moving down the receiving line in her plain ivory gown, the cream lace retrimmed from last season because there had been no reason to buy new, was that she was hostess of Ashworth Hall for 8 months and would remain so. That Gerald Ashworth's solicitor had sent a letter 3 days previous, that the letter sat in the top drawer of her late husband's writing table, its seals still crisp, its contents entirely clear, and that she had chosen to open the ball anyway, because the ball was hers to open, and because retreating from that fact would make it less true in ways no court of chancery could afterwards correct. Ashworth Hall had been her home for 4 years. She had arrived at 22 as a bride, had learned its corridors in the first winter, its kitchen garden in the first spring, its peculiar habit of letting cold air in through the east passage in the second autumn. She had sat at its drawing-room table through 2 harvest seasons, managed its household accounts, visited its tenants, nursed its elderly housekeeper Mrs. Holt through a fever that had kept the woman bedridden for 6 weeks one January. When her husband died in October, the estate had passed into the legal question of his cousin's claim, and Philippa had understood, with a clarity that arrived before the grief had finished, that she would need to hold Ashworth Hall in every way the law permitted, while that question resolved itself. The ball was part of that holding. She had sent 63 invitations in April. 63 acceptances had come back by June. The roses were from the hall's own garden. The musicians were the same quartet her husband had hired for the Christmas assembly 2 years prior. Everything was exactly as it had been, except that the man whose name was on the estate ledgers was in the churchyard, and she was standing at the top of the receiving line in his place. The dismissive judgments had begun arriving before the candles were lit. Ms. Anne Hartwell, wife of the local magistrate, had paused in greeting with an expression of bright, careful sympathy, and said quite audibly to the woman beside her, "Such a brave face for a widow on uncertain ground." Philippa had thanked her for coming and moved to the next guest. An hour into the ball, she overheard young Mr. Ford near the punch bowl informing his companion that the whole entertainment was very well done, considering that the hostess had no real claim to be giving it. She kept her face composed and her hands still at her sides. It was shortly after this that her neighbor, Mr. Balfour, appeared at her elbow with a man she did not know, and an expression she recognized as the slightly apologetic cheerfulness of someone who had done something he expected she would find complicated. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "I must present the Duke of Callanmere. He was asked to stand up with the hostess at the ball, and I took the liberty of promising he should. You won't refuse, I think." She looked at the man beside him. Close. He was still and dark, and faintly severe, with a jaw that suggested a quality of discipline she associated with men who had decided, at some early point, that the world required managing before it would be bearable. His cravat was white and precisely tied. There was no softness in his face at all, and his eyes, looking down at her from a considerable height, had the quality of a man who was deciding something rather than performing a greeting. He said, "Mrs. Ashworth," with a slight inclination of his head. She said, "Your Grace," and curtsied correctly, and understood that Mr. Balfour's careful phrase had meant exactly what it said. The Duke had been engaged for a dance, as a social kindness extended to a widow whose position in the room was uncertain. He would stand up with her because he had been asked to. That was all. She did not find the prospect comforting, precisely, but it was a small, practical fact she could place alongside the other small, practical facts she was assembling this evening, like stones laid across uncertain ground. They danced the second set. He said very little. He guided her through the figures with a competence that suggested he had danced a great many sets in his life, and thought about none of them, which she found, against all expectation, slightly easier to manage than conversation would have been. When the figures brought them together, she was aware of the precise warmth of his hand through her glove, and of the way he moved, controlled, and unhurried, as though he had decided in advance exactly how much of his attention the dance warranted, and was delivering precisely that amount. He asked, at one turning, whether the hall had been in her husband's family long. She said it had been in the Ashworth family for 70 years, and that she had been its chatelaine for 4 of those. He said nothing more. The music resolved, and he returned her to the edge of the floor with a bow that was correct in every particular. She went to speak to her housekeeper. Mrs. Holt was 63 years old and had been at Ashworth Hall since before Philippa's husband was born. She kept the linen inventory in her head and had once, in the second winter, quietly rearranged the entire larder without being asked in order to prevent a particular kind of mold that had been threatening the stores, and she had been right. Philippa had trusted her judgment on 100 small domestic questions, and would have trusted it on 100 more. She found Mrs. Holt in the passage off the ballroom's east corridor, near the door that led to the supper room, and she found her there because Gerald Ashworth was also there. Gerald was 38, and carried the particular confidence of a man who had spent his life adjacent to property he expected eventually to own. He was her husband's cousin, and the only surviving Ashworth male, and since October he had made his interest in the Hall's future quite clear in the way such men tended to make things clear, through solicitors and carefully worded social inquiries and the occasional appearance at the Hall itself on grounds of family sentiment. He was speaking to Mrs. Holt when Philippa came through the passage door, speaking in the low, level, deliberate tone that a man uses when he wishes to frighten someone who has no power to refuse him. "The inventory," he was saying, "will be required by Thursday." "Not as a request, Mrs. Holt. A requirement." Mrs. Holt stood with her hands folded before her, and her face arranged into the expression of a woman who has spent 63 years absorbing the requirements of people with more power than herself. She said very quietly, "I serve Mrs. Ashworth, Mr. Gerald." "You serve the estate," he said. "The estate's disposition is currently in question. You serve whoever holds the estate, and that question is not yet settled." Philippa said, from the doorway, "The question is quite settled for this evening, Mr. Ashworth. Mrs. Holt is attending to the supper room, as I asked her to. If you have a request to make of my household, you may make it through my solicitor." Gerald turned. He looked at her with the expression she had learned to expect from him. The patient, slightly amused patience of a man who believes he is dealing with something temporary. "Cousin Philippa," he said, "what a devoted hostess you are." "I am the hostess." she said. That is all I said. She held the doorway and did not move until he had gone back down the passage toward the ballroom, his footsteps unhurried, his shoulders entirely unbothered by the exchange. Then she looked at Mrs. Holt. "Are you well?" she said. "Quite well, ma'am," Mrs. Holt said, in a voice that was almost steady. Philippa squeezed the woman's hand once, briefly, and returned to the ball. She did not know that she had been watched. The Duke of Callanmere had stepped into the passage from the far end, following some instinct he had not yet named, and had stopped at the east corridor's shadow when he saw what was occurring. He had stood there while she spoke, and he had been still in the way that he was, frequently still, entirely, with a quality of attention that was entirely focused. He had watched her hold the doorway. He had watched Gerald leave. He had watched her touch Mrs. Holt's hand. He did not return to the ballroom immediately. He went instead to the east study, which was unlocked, which was something he had noted earlier when the hall's rooms had been briefly opened for the guests' comfort. The room was lit only by a single branch of candles on the writing table. The portrait above the mantelpiece was turned to face the wall. He stood in front of the reversed canvas for a long moment. The frame was gilded. Whatever had faced outward was now pressed against the wall's plaster, and all that remained was the wooden stretcher and the canvas's back, anonymous and pale in the candlelight. His ward had been 7 years old when she died. He had been her guardian for 3 of those years, since her father's death at sea, and he had done what was required, provided what was required, fulfilled every procedural and financial obligation the role demanded. What he had not done, which was the thing he thought about in rooms like this one, in the quiet spaces between one social occasion and the next, was enough. He had believed, for 3 years, that enough was all that was required of him. That management and provision and correct procedure constituted care. That a child who was fed and housed and schooled was a child who was well looked after. He had been wrong. He had understood the precise dimensions of his error only after she was gone. He did not discuss it. He had no language for it that was not also a kind of accusation of himself, and he had learned that such discussions produced sympathy he did not want and advice that could not help. He kept the portrait in whatever room he occupied and turned it to face the wall when he entered, which was not a resolution and was not a comfort, and was simply the way that he managed the fact of it. He left the east study and went to find Mr. Rowe, Philippa's solicitor, who was, he had ascertained earlier, taking supper in the card room. Mr. Rowe was a thin, careful man in his 50s who received the Duke's company with appropriate surprise and sufficient composure. Christopher sat across from him and asked directly about Gerald Ashworth's legal position. Mr. Rowe, who was discreet, hesitated once, assessed the Duke's rank and evident seriousness, and then spoke plainly. Gerald's claim rested on a debt he alleged the estate owed him from a private loan made to Philippa's late husband, totaling £3,000. There was, as yet, no documentation the court would accept as legally conclusive. Gerald's solicitor had presented a notice, but the notice was not a judgment. Mrs. Ashworth's dower rights were fully intact. The claim was a pressure, not a decision. Gerald was betting that the social weight of his presence and his noise would achieve what his legal position could not yet compel. Christopher asked one more question. He asked whether the solicitor would be willing to make that position clear, in plain language, to whatever witnesses might be present if the moment required it. Mr. Rowe considered for a moment. He said he supposed he would. Christopher nodded, thanked him, and returned to the ballroom. He was looking for Mrs. Ashworth when he found, instead, Lady Dorothea Vane. His great-aunt was 71 years old and had been managing his social life, or attempting to, since his wife died 4 years previous. She was a woman of formidable composure and specific convictions, and her conviction about this particular evening was that it represented a social error of some consequence. She had accepted the invitation because she had understood he would be here, and she had brought Miss Cecily Ford, who was 20, composed, entirely suitable, and currently standing at his great-aunt's elbow with the patient expression of a woman who had been told she was the correct choice and believed it. Lady Dorothea said, "There you are, Christopher. I had begun to think you had wandered into one of the back passages." She said it pleasantly, as she said most things. He said, "I had business to attend to." "In a widowed hostess's hall," she said, equally pleasantly. "I cannot imagine what." Miss Ford smiled faintly. She was not unkind, he thought. She had simply been arranged in a particular direction and was moving that way, as one does when one has been told since childhood which direction is correct. He said nothing about Philippa. He looked across the ballroom and found her at last, near the long windows that overlooked the garden, speaking to a pair of older women with the composed, unhurried attention she brought to everything he had observed her doing this evening. Lady Dorothea followed his gaze. "A widow on very uncertain ground," she said, which was not, he noted, precisely her own assessment, since she had not spoken to Philippa this evening, but which she had gathered from the room's consensus and was now presenting as established fact. "Gerald Ashworth is in the right of it, I understand. The estate's claim is not as settled as she presents," he said. "Gerald Ashworth's claim is a social one, not a legal one." His great-aunt looked at him with the particular patience of a woman who has heard men say confident things and learned to wait for them to be proven wrong or right. She said, "We shall see, shan't we?" The moment came 40 minutes later. Gerald had arranged it, Christopher saw afterwards, with some care. He had chosen the turning between sets, when the floor was at its most open and the guests most attentive, loosened by supper and moving from one formation to the next. He crossed the ballroom floor with his solicitor's letter in his hand, and he crossed it toward Philippa, who was standing near the room's center, and he said, loudly enough that the guests nearest could hear, and the silence would then carry it to those who could not, "I think it is time we addressed this publicly, cousin." Philippa did not step back. Christopher, watching from near the east wall, noted that. She stood exactly where she was, her chin level, her hands still, and she said, "I am not certain what you mean, Mr. Ashworth." "I mean," he said, "that this ball is being given from an estate under dispute, by a hostess whose right to the title is considerably less certain than she has allowed her guests to believe." He held up the letter. £3,000, Cousin Philippa. Your husband's acknowledged debt to me, unpaid at his death, sufficient to call the estate's present management into serious question. He had timed it exactly. Lady Dorothea, from her chair near the far wall, said clearly, "I was told as much. It seems the evening's entertainment has been rather optimistically staged." Her tone was not loud. It did not need to be. The ballroom had gone very still. 63 persons stood in the suspended quiet of a room that had just been shown something they could not yet decide how to read. The musicians had stopped, recognizing the particular silence. A candle guttered in the draught from the garden windows. Miss Ford, standing near the dowager's chair, pressed her fan against her gloved wrist and said nothing, which was the correct response for a woman who had been told to let events arrange themselves in her favor. Philippa stood at the ballroom's center and looked at the letter in Gerald's hand. She thought of Mrs. Holt's folded hands in the passage. She thought of the east corridor, which let in cold air in autumn because a stone at the foundation had shifted and she had had it repaired in the second year. She thought of the rose garden and the kitchen inventory and the 63 faces currently watching her from the polished perimeter of her own ballroom. She thought of the top drawer of the writing table where Gerald's solicitor's letter sat with its crisp seals, and she thought of the morning 4 days ago when she had read it, and then put it away and written her own notes for the ball's seating instead. She was not, she found, afraid. She said, "Ashworth Hall is my home. It was my home when I came to it 4 years ago, and it is my home this evening, and I am its hostess. If Mr. Ashworth has a legal claim to present, he is welcome to present it to my solicitor, whose name and address are known to him. This is not a courtroom. This is a ball, which I have given in my home for my guests." She paused, and she held the room without retreating from a single inch of it. "I hope everyone will be seated for the next set." It was not a speech. It was simply the truth, delivered steadily. Several people, she noticed, looked at one another. Colonel Merritt's wife pressed her lips together in an expression that was not quite a smile. Gerald's expression had shifted. Not to retreat. Not yet. But to the particular recalculation of a man who had expected a different response and was adjusting his angle. He opened his mouth. Christopher crossed the room. She heard it as a change in the room's quality rather than as a specific sound. The crowd parting, conversations interrupted, a path opening without anyone choosing to open it. Because when a duke moves through a room with that quality of purpose, rooms move accordingly. She turned her head, and he was there, 3 strides away, and then 2, and then 1. And he stopped beside her, not in front of her, not between her and the room, but beside her, at the angle from which a man makes it evident by his placement alone that the person next to him has his full sanction. He looked at Gerald. He said, "Mr. Rowe will confirm for any guest who wishes it that Mr. Ashworth's debt notice is not a legal judgment and has no force against Mrs. Ashworth's dower rights, which are fully intact. I have spoken with him this evening. Any guest who has heard otherwise has heard incorrectly." There was a silence. Mr. Rowe, who was standing at the edge of the room with the particular expression of a solicitor who had known this moment was coming, said, without being asked, and clearly, "His Grace is correct. The claim is unresolved. Mrs. Ashworth's right to this hall is not in question this evening." Gerald said, "Now, see here." But he said it in a voice that had lost its earlier confidence, had become the voice of a man who was still holding the letter, but had begun to understand that the letter was no longer the most powerful object in the room. Christopher said, "I believe Mrs. Ashworth asked the room to be seated for the next set." It was not, precisely, a command. He did not raise his voice. He simply said it in the way that a man says a thing when he expects it to be done, and the room, attending to the particular authority in his tone, began to arrange itself accordingly. Couples moved toward the floor. A footman stepped to refill glasses. The musicians lifted their instruments. Gerald Ashworth, standing with his letter in an emptying center of the room, looked for a moment like a man who had expected to win something and found himself holding only paper. Lady Dorothea, in her chair against the wall, watched her great-nephew stand beside the widow. She was a woman of formidable intelligence as well as formidable conviction, and in this moment her intelligence was showing her something her conviction had not anticipated. She had spent this evening assembling Gerald's social leverage alongside her own, had added her voice to his claim in the expectation that the Duke's presence at the ball was incidental, a social courtesy to an acquaintance, nothing more. The placement had told her otherwise. The placement told her that her assessment had been incomplete, and Lady Dorothea Vane, whatever her convictions, had enough honesty to recognize an incomplete assessment when its consequences were standing 2 feet in front of her. She pressed her fan closed. She did not speak. Miss Ford, who was perceptive in the way that young women who have been raised to read rooms must be perceptive, looked at the floor beside the dowager's chair, and found a sudden interest in the pattern of the parquet. The next set was called. If you are moved by a story told slowly and with full weight, given to every small act of courage, this channel is where such stories live. Consider adding your voice to those who gather here, because the stories are told for exactly the listener you are. Philippa danced the third set with Colonel Merritt, who was a solid, kind man who talked about his horses and asked nothing of her beyond the figures. She was glad of him. Her hands had stopped trembling somewhere in the middle of the second figure, which they had been doing, she now realized, since the moment she had spoken in the ballroom's center, the trembling invisible inside her gloves, present only to herself. Christopher did not dance again that evening. He stood near the terrace door for a time with Mr. Balfour, and then he spoke for 20 minutes with Mrs. Hartwell, who emerged from the conversation looking considerably less certain about several things than she had looked going into it. He was methodical, she understood, watching him from across the room. He was someone who had decided on a course of action and was carrying it out in the most thorough way available to him, which appeared to be, in this case, speaking quietly and with great precision to each person in the room who carried social weight. Gerald left before supper was finished. He went without announcement, which was in itself a kind of answer. The ball ended at midnight. Philippa stood at the hall's entrance as the guests departed, as she had stood at its beginning, and received their farewells in the same composed order in which she had received their arrivals. Several people pressed her hand. Mrs. Hartwell paused and said, with more warmth than she had managed earlier, "A very fine evening, Mrs. Ashworth. The roses were particularly lovely." It was not an apology, but it was something in the neighborhood of one, and Philippa accepted it exactly as it was offered. Lady Dorothea departed with Miss Ford on her arm. She passed Philippa at the door and stopped for a moment, regarding her with the assessing composure of a woman who had revised her position and was not yet accustomed to the new one. She said, "You kept your ground." "It was my ground," Philippa said. The dowager considered this. Then she inclined her head, once, with a formality that was not warmth, but was not without a kind of recognition, and moved on. Christopher was the last to leave. He stood in the entrance hall while his coat was brought, and the footman withdrew, and the noise of the departing guests diminished down the drive, and the hall settled around them into its own quiet. It was the quiet of a house that had held 63 people and was now holding 2, and Philippa was conscious of it in her shoulders, the particular release of tension that comes when the performance of a thing is finished and one is left with only the thing itself. She said, "You did not need to do that." He said, "I know." She looked at him. The candlelight in the entrance hall was dimmer now, 2 sconces and the branch near the door, and in it his face was less severe than it had been in the ballroom. Or perhaps she was simply reading it differently, having watched it for several hours. She said, "Mr. Balfour told me you were asked to stand up with the hostess. I understood it to mean a social kindness." "It was not a social kindness," he said. She waited. He said, "I came because I wished to come. I was told you would be here, and that the evening was one you had arranged yourself, and I wished to see it." He paused. The pause was the particular pause of a man who is accustomed to speaking concisely and is now finding that concision is not quite adequate to what he is trying to say. "I did not know, when I arrived, what the evening required. I know now." She did not entirely know what to say to this. Her understanding of the evening had arranged itself around the certainty that she was managing alone, and she was discovering that the certainty had been partially incorrect, and the discovery was a strange, disorienting warmth. She said, "The portrait in the east study, the one turned to the wall." He went still, in the way that she had observed him go still several times this evening, entirely. She said, "I am sorry. I should not have mentioned it." "No," he said. "You may mention it." He looked at the middle distance for a moment, and she understood from the quality of the look that the portrait had some significance that was not decorative. He said, "She was my ward. She died 3 years ago. I was responsible for her." He said it in the level, careful way of a man who has compressed a large and painful thing into the smallest accurate statement he can manage. She did not offer sympathy in the way that people offered it, the bright, careful phrases that wrapped a grief and presented it back in a more socially manageable form. She said, "The East Study gets cold in the autumn. I can have it better prepared, if you should happen to be here then." He looked at her. She realized, an instant after she had said it, that the statement contained an assumption she had not yet been given permission to make, and she felt warmth climb from her collarbone to her throat. He said, "I should be glad of that." She let out a breath she had not known she was holding. The first snow came in November. Not the hard winter snow of February, nothing that would keep the roads, but the first tentative fall of the season, the kind that arrives in the night and is visible by morning as a thin white layer over the garden beds, the kind that transforms familiar things into something more considered and still. Philippa woke to it and stood at the bedroom window, looking out at the rose garden in its thin white coat. The canes bare now, the beds cut back for winter, the whole garden resting in the way that gardens rest when they have finished one season's work and are preparing for the next. She dressed and went downstairs. The great hearth in the hall was lit. Mrs. Holt had seen to it before anyone was properly awake, as she saw to most things, and the fire was established and steady, its warmth reaching to the middle of the hall's stone floor, the light of it painting the paneling in amber. Philippa stood before it for a moment, with her hands held toward the heat. Christopher came downstairs 20 minutes later. He had arrived 2 days previous, as he had said he would, and the hall had accommodated him with the straightforward ease of a house that had been well managed and knew how to receive a guest. Mrs. Holt had prepared the south rooms, which had the best morning light, and had put hothouse flowers in the sitting room from the small collection Philippa kept going through the cold months, and had said nothing at all about any of it beyond a calm inquiry about the guest's preference in breakfast. He came into the hall and found her at the fire, and looked at her in the way that she had learned, over the weeks since the ball, to read more accurately than she had first managed. He was not demonstrative. He did not rearrange his face into warmth the way that men who were performing warmth tended to do. What he did was arrive in a room and allow the quality of his attention to communicate what his expression did not, and what it communicated now was the specific ease of a man who is exactly where he chose to be. He said, "It has snowed." She said, "It has." He came to stand beside her at the fire, and they looked out together through the hall's tall windows at the whitened garden, the snow still coming down in small, unhurried flakes, settling over the rose canes and the gravel walk and the stone bench near the garden wall that she had sat on in June while planning the midsummer ball. She said, "I went into the East Study yesterday to have Mrs. Holt light the fire in advance of your arrival." He said, "I noticed?" She said, "I brought the portrait down from the wall." There was a pause. She kept her eyes on the garden. He said, "How does it look?" She said, "Like a child who was loved." She said it carefully, because she meant it carefully, and because she had looked at the portrait for some time before deciding that it was true. "She has your eyes, I think. Or something like them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was very young. She deserved someone who understood sooner." "Yes," Philippa said. But someone did understand, and understanding is not undone by being late. She felt the quality of his stillness beside her change, in the way that his stillness sometimes changed, not breaking, but deepening, becoming the stillness of a person who has been given something and is absorbing it carefully, as though he is not entirely accustomed to receiving. He did not speak immediately. Outside, the snow continued its small, unhurried descent over the rose garden and the gravel walk, and the stone bench and the hall's winter-pale fields beyond the garden wall. He said at last, "I had thought to speak to you formally about the matter of remaining, of what remaining here might mean, and what I am able to offer, and what I should like to ask." She said, "Are you asking now?" He said, "I am asking now." She turned from the window, and he turned with her, and the fire was at their backs, and the hall was quiet around them, and she looked at him in the amber light, and saw, quite clearly, a man who had been cold for a long time, and was choosing, carefully, and at some cost to whatever had previously kept him ordered, to stop. She said, "Then yes." The great hearth went on burning. The snow went on falling in the garden. From the upper corridor, the faint sound of Mrs. Holt's footsteps crossed toward the east study, where the portrait of a small girl with dark eyes hung on its wall again in a room that was warm and lit and ready. Ashworth Hall held them all. If Philippa's story settled something in you this evening, leave a word in the comments about the moment that struck you most. There are more stories here, told in the same careful register, and the channel is glad of your company.